Something that I have never once heard another podcast expert talking about is how the unconscious tones in your podcast voice might actually be causing listeners not to trust you enough as an expert, which is affecting your podcast ability not only to attract new listeners, but to keep the listeners you have engaged with your show, and ultimately affecting the ability of your podcast to convert those listeners to leads. And I know this because this happened to me for the first 2+ years of running my podcast. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was one of the biggest underlying reasons why, despite giving away my best content in every single episode, my show still wasn't growing as I expected it to. So in this episode, I'm going to unpack why this happens and give you the first steps that you can take to keep this from happening to you. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Typically, there are two types of people who tune into this podcast. On the one hand, it's the person who's been dreaming of starting a podcast, but hasn't yet because they want to do it right and they value their time and they don't want to spend their time creating a show that nobody's going to listen to. On the other hand, it's the person who has started their podcast. In fact, they've had that podcast for 6 months or more, but they're still stuck under 1,000 downloads per episode. And over the lifetime of their podcast, they've converted less than 10 listeners to clients. And there's often several reasons why this happens. But most people tend to think, well, it's just because my audience isn't big enough yet. I need a bigger audience. I need to grow my listener base. I need more downloads. And so they spend all their time and energy trying to grow their podcast and their audience, thinking that, well, when I have a bigger audience, then more people are going to buy. It's going to increase the chances of people buying. But have you ever stopped to think about why the audience you have right now isn't converting? Think about it. If the audience you already have isn't buying, what makes you think that a bigger audience will? Here's the thing that most podcast experts won't tell you. But the truth is, audience size and podcast conversions have nothing to do with each other. In fact, most podcast experts who preach about podcast growth, they're not going to tell you this. But think about it. If the listeners you already have aren't converting to leads, well, the natural first step isn't, let me go out there and grow my listener base. The natural first step should be, let's actually take a step back and notice why the listeners you have aren't converting to begin with. And usually I see 3 reasons why this happens. Number 1, your podcast messaging and or your positioning for your podcast is off. And what's happening is that because this is off, it's causing you to blend in with other experts who teach something similar to you. Even if it's not exactly the same, even if your methodology is unique and different, your listener can't discern the difference. So it's causing you to blend in with other people and other podcasts like yours. And even worse, it could actually be causing you to attract the wrong listeners to your show, which increases the likelihood of those listeners not converting. So it could be negatively impacting your podcast conversions in that way. But another reason why I see this happen is because you're not creating as much desire or demand for what you offer as you think you are inside of your episodes. And then third, and most importantly, if I had to sit here and argue which one of these is the most important, yes, messaging and positioning is super important. Yes, knowing how to create desire and demand for what you offer is so important. It's key. If you want a top 100 podcast, you got to have these 2 things dialed in. But arguably, more importantly, it's because your listeners might be picking up on unconscious tones in your voice that cause them not to trust you enough as an expert, no matter how much valuable content you share. I've spent thousands of hours working with clients, studying their podcasts, studying what separates the top podcasts from the ones that go unnoticed. And the one thing I can promise you is that if you don't address these underlying issues, your podcast will continue struggling to grow. And it'll be very difficult for you to convert listeners to leads. And here's the thing. I know that you're someone who values your time. You podcast because you want to make a real difference in people's lives. And in order to grow your show, yes, you and I both know there's going to be some strategy that goes into that. There's going to be some key elements that we need to have in place in your messaging and in your positioning so that you can attract the right listener to your podcast and increase the likelihood of being able to convert that listener to a client, to a customer for your business. And we can sit here and talk strategy all day long. But even deeper than that, and always deeper than that, is going to be your ability to earn your listeners' trust as the host of your podcast, because you and I both know that trust is the prerequisite for any sale to happen. So of these three reasons, the one that has always fascinated me the most is the power that your voice carries, whether you realize it or not. Chances are you might have heard that 93% of communication is nonverbal, meaning that it's not what you say, but how you say it that matters the most. So this is why the unconscious tones and the inflections and the sounds that we pick up on in each other's voices cause us to either lean in and pay attention or to dismiss and to tune a person out. These unconscious tones and inflections are what cause people to trust you as an expert or not. People nowadays tell me, oh my gosh, Courtney, you have the perfect voice for podcasting. I could listen to you all day. You're so easy to listen to. I love listening to you. I love your voice. But I'm going to tell you right now, it was not always this way. Why? Because the voice that you hear today was not the way that my voice always used to sound. What you hear right now is the closest to my true God-given authentic voice that my voice has ever been. But for many years, my voice actually drove people away. It affected my ability to grow my podcast in the early days of my show. It majorly affected my ability to be able to convert clients and to close people on sales calls, and even to be heard in conversations without being interrupted or talked over and dismissed. And when you begin to look at the human voice through the lens of psychology, all of this starts to make sense. So let me just give you a quick scenario to illustrate this at work. Okay, let's say that you're in your house, you're the only one at home, and you walk into the back room and you notice that the light in the closet has been left on. Whose voice do you immediately hear in your head? For me, it's my dad. Turn off the light. That is wasteful. Do you know how wasteful it is? Do you know how much energy it costs to leave those lights on? Right? And it's like that voice just all of a sudden takes over and it's like, turn the light off, turn the light off. Or what about, let's say you wake up and you're in the middle of your morning and you're just running around from one thing to the next and you're rushing and this and that, and you're tempted to leave your bed unmade. Now, for some of you, there's going to be definitely a class of people here who do not care about this. And there's other scenarios here that I'm sure will be equally powerful triggers for you. But this is a powerful trigger for me. Because guess what? Every time I walk into my bedroom and my bed is not made, I hear my mom, a room immediately looks cleaner when the bed is made. Okay, mom, can you get out of my head already, right? Maybe you don't relate to either of those scenarios, but I'm willing to bet you can think of at least one scenario where there is some sort of trigger. And immediately you hear this little voice in your head. And I am willing to bet that voice isn't yours. So think about it this way. If your voice is not the only one in your head, and if your thoughts control how your voice sounds when you speak, then your voice is not the only one that listeners hear when they listen to your podcast. And I'll share more on that in a moment. But first, I want to show you how this very truth, this psychological truth, affected me in a very real way for the better part of my life. I was about 9 years old at the time. And I can remember this like yesterday. I was standing in the kitchen and I was mouthing off about something to my mom. I was a very outspoken, firstborn, opinionated girl, older sister, always the boss. And I was telling my mom off about something. I couldn't tell you what it was. But I will never forget how she turned and looked at me with water dripping down off of her arms, off her elbows, washing dishes. And she looks at me and she goes, Courtney, your mouth is what gets you into trouble. Go to your room. And from that time onward, I began to be punished for speaking up. My mom was trying to channel my opinionatedness, my outspokenness, and she was trying to teach me respect. But instead, what my brain did was my brain began to associate speaking up and being authentically me with pain. So what it did was it caused me to begin to hide parts of myself from the world and to show up as I thought others wanted me to show up versus showing up as my true self, because I was afraid of not belonging. I was afraid of being rejected for who I was. And for the better part of my life, I began to believe that on some level, nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. And for over 20 years, I carried that voice in my head, which very literally affected not only how I saw myself and how I thought about myself and how I perceived the world, but quite literally affected how I sounded whenever I spoke. Fast forward. I was 25 years old, 2 days after getting home from our honeymoon, sitting in the doctor's office, receiving a diagnosis that changed my life as I knew it. I had just been diagnosed with thyroid cancer. Now, I can remember this like yesterday. There's that fluorescent light and it's like flickering overhead. My brand new husband sitting in the chair next to me, I'm gripping his hand. And you know those scenes in the movies where like everything kind of slows down and it just kind of gets blurry and you can't really hear what's happening, but you're kind of sensing what's happening around you. It was like one of those scenes happening in real life. And I'm sitting there and I can hear my doctor saying, now the worst risk of this surgery is that your vocal cords could be severed and you may never speak again. Looking back now, the irony of that is not lost on me. I get paid to use my voice now. Take that, karma. Look, God has always had his hand on this. And my voice, which at first was my most powerful nemesis, has now become my most powerful tool. But there was a lot that was getting in the way of me being able to use it intentionally and effectively, and use it as God has intended me to use it, for how I've been created to use it. And so some people like to refer to the voices in our head as our inner critic. But I like to look at it more specifically than that. It's the voices that have influenced, and to some degree might still be influencing, your ability to think, to act, and to speak without you even realizing it. And we carry these voices in our head at all times. They influence our thoughts, which influences how we say what we say, which to a large degree means that your audience can actually hear what you're thinking whenever you speak. And nowhere is this more evident or apparent or obvious than on a podcast, than on an audio medium. Why? Because there is no visual to distract. There is no written text to distract. It's you and your listener. So think about this. If the voices in your head, the internal voices, the external voices, the spoken voices, the unspoken voices, the positive voices, the uplifting voices, the negative voices, the discouraging voices, if all of those are in your head at all times, influencing how you show up, what you think, what you say, how you present yourself, think about how this might be impacting your business, your ability to sell, to convert. Think about how this might be impacting your podcast, your ability to engage and convert. If your prospects can hear your self-doubt on a sales call, do you think they're going to buy? No. If your voice wavers, even if it's just a little bit, if it cracks or peaks or lifts when you reveal the price on a live workshop, you think they're going to believe in the value of what you offer? No. If you tack on words like right and, at the end of every sentence, even when you're teaching on your podcast, you're the expert, this is your unconscious brain's search for validation. Do you think people are going to trust you as an expert? Heck no. It's not the ums and the ahs that are going to kill your podcast growth. Because a fancy mic and expert editing won't mask what people can hear in your voice when they listen. Case in point, I don't listen to podcasts often. I prefer to stay in my lane. I focus on my craft. And if there is another podcast of someone doing something similar to me or in a similar niche as me, I tend not to listen because often those voices will impede my ability to hear my own voice and to tap into my inner wisdom to be able to show up and share here with you every week. But occasionally, I will listen to podcasts that are outside of my niche. Health and fitness is a great example. And recently, someone sent me a podcast episode on a topic in the health space that is totally opposite of what the mainstream beliefs are about this particular topic. And I started listening to this episode, and there was a doctor on this episode who was sharing. Now, this doctor, you could tell she was an expert in the sense that she's written multiple books. She's been studying this topic for 20 plus years. And in the episode, what was so mind-blowing to me was how, with all of her knowledge and all of her expertise, how much she struggled to show up as an expert. You could literally hear the questioning in her voice. It was almost as if her unconscious mind was asking, do you believe me? Am I crazy? It was really difficult to listen to. She wasn't consciously aware of this, and I'm not calling her out. This is the problem because most of us don't actually realize what we're doing. It's unconscious, which is why we need to bring our awareness to it and start consciously working on this. She's a doctor, for goodness sake. She's got years of research under her belt. But because her approach was totally the opposite of what most people are indoctrinated to believe as far as this particular topic was concerned, her questioning and her almost asking both the host and the listener, do you believe me? Like, I know this sounds crazy and I've researched it all this time, but like, I know it's a little out there, right? And that was what was coming through her voice, and it undermined her message. Still super valuable information, but it undermined her expertise. It eroded the trust that listeners could have had in listening to her. So, this boils down to the fact that if you're not making the kind of revenue that you want to be making in your business yet, or if your podcast isn't growing like you want it to yet, chances are it might have something to do with your message. In many cases it does, but even more importantly, it has to do with how you're delivering that message. So the big question here is, how do we fix this? And I will be completely honest with you, it is hard work. Unlearning, I should say, how to hear, how to trust, how to own and how to use your voice in the way that you're meant to. It's a process. It is one that has taken me years to work through. I am still working on it. I will probably always be working on it. But the good news is that once you understand the role that your mind plays and the way that your voice actually sounds as it leaves your lips and travels through the microphone and into the headphones of the person listening, then you can begin to master your ability to connect with people on a real level, on an authentic level. Like people always throw around that word, authentic, right? But what does that actually mean? It means showing up as you and not for a second trying to be anyone that you're not. And when you have that level of transparency with your listeners, guess what? It's going to increase trust, which ultimately is going to increase conversions. It's going to make them hang on your every word and listen till the end of the episodes and come back to listen again and rave about your show and share episodes with their friends. And if you need proof, scroll down, check the reviews on this show. People don't throw around the word bingeworthy very often, yet it's been used more than once, multiple times, in describing this show because of not so much the strategy, not so much what I teach, but the way in which that I show up for you and with you in every single episode. And in the next episode, I'm going to show you the shockingly simple secret to increasing your listener engagement with nothing other than your voice. And I'll show you the steps that I've taken, not only to find my voice, to own it and to trust it, but to learn how to use it as a powerful tool for creating more income and greater impact. So come with me to the next episode and let's make your business binge-worthy.